Jackson was an immensely talented person, working at Channel 32 primarily. Did some work for Channel 7 as well, but the principal element or period of his career was at Channel 32, which at that time was not viewed as one of the major stations. It was a UHF station, which was kind of hard to sell to Chicago. He had a tremendous following. He put on the feel of a national show at the local level.
And he did everything.
He produced it, he wrote it, he manipulated the characters, he created the characters, he just did everything. And I would say that if you were growing up in Pittsburgh or you were growing up in Philadelphia or New York or some other city other than Chicago, and you mentioned the name Jim Henson, everybody would remember Jim Henson as the guy that created the Muppets. If you grew up in Chicago, you knew that Bill Jackson and Jim Henson were very much alike. Only Henson's fame and fortune came at the network level. Bill Jackson's came at the local level, but they were equally talented and made immense contributions to the enjoyment of millions of children growing up all over the country, but with Bill Jackson growing up in Chicago, watching Channel 32.
The first show was Clown Alley. And also a weekly show called Here Comes Freckles. And they brought me here to do a clown show, which I didn't really want to do, I have to admit. I'd never done a clown show. Certainly appreciate people who do good clown shows, but I'd never done one. And we kind of struggled with that. I gave it my best shot, and it was okay, except it started at 6:35 in the morning. Okay, any future program directors out there? Think about that. The pivotal point happened when BBM let me go, and the manager, bless his heart, he felt bad about it, and so he said, "I'll tell you what, we'll let you cut a pilot using our facilities." And I cut a pilot there, and of course I got to be myself, and I had people who had worked with me came up to me and says, "Why didn't they let you do this to start with?" And it was on the basis of that pilot that I went to Channel 32. It started as Cartoon Town. Then it went live. There was a live audience show, which was called BJ and Dirty Dragon, which
was that the life-size?
Yes, had the life-size characters. And we just had one great time, except I don't think it ever left the transmitter. We had a great time in the studio, but it just couldn't catch on. It was patterned a little bit after the stage show that I was doing. I shot Giggle Snort, which was the biggest production show. I mean, I brought everything I could do from Cartoon Town and put it into Giggle Snort in different format, and I realized it wasn't quite the same Cartoon Town format because I wasn't allowed to do that anymore. I had to have a show that would get FCC credit for being what they call worthwhile programming. So I had to redo that a little bit, but I brought all the production into that, and it was in the smallest studio I ever worked in my life. It was a little cubby hole. They got these other studios there, but there's this little one that's not any much bigger than this room we're in. And we had multiple sets and all kinds of stuff breaking loose.
And talk about a one-man band. He did everything, and I knew there were certain people on the crews at 32 that, just dreaded being on his show because they'd have to work. It wasn't like, a talking head news show where you'd aim the camera and then, sit there, or a discussion show. They actually had to work and move the cameras and follow things. And, that was, oh my God, how dare he make us work for a living? But he tried to pull off some amazing stuff and actually succeeded, which was so great.
Bill Jackson's the most interesting guy to me, not to degrade anybody else in Chicago television. He's the most interesting guy from the respect that he had to create his own shows himself. He was primarily like a free agent in the respect that at GN, they had people to build the sets, they had people to write the scripts, and they did that very well. With Bill Jackson, he came in with an idea, and because nobody else at the station had his imagination or really knew what he was, what his intent was, he pretty much had to take charge of everything. That's in addition to performing on the show and manipulating the puppets.
There are so many names that belong right up there with mine and the directors, the puppeteers, sound effects engineers, or sound engineers. You see, we did live on tape. There was no post, and you don't do a heavy production show like that live on tape. You're committing suicide. I mean, all the cues have to hit just like that. Dialogue has to be just right. All the sound, all the music. Stagehands have to put things here and take it away, correctly. And the camera operators, to keep those puppeteer heads out of the shot, we're talking about precise cropping. And as one of my puppeteers reminded me, sort of laughing, one of the big difficulties for the camera operators is when the puppet moved away from the camera, you had to adjust. You had to adjust, or else there's a puppeteer and a puppet moving away from the camera, So, yeah, it took a standard that some didn't really want to do, but a lot of them did. I had a great compliment when I was at WLS. Now, you know that the engineers stay forever. You can change management. You can change kid show hosts. You can, a real revolving door. But the engineers stay forever, so they get kind of jaded. I mean, they've seen everything, and they're just going to work. And when I was at WLS doing Giggle Snort, I heard that not just one, but engineers were doing the show and then going home and at the family table telling their kids what they'd done that day. Now that was a tremendous compliment.
If you've never seen the Bozo show before, it's kind of like a big vaudeville show for kids. This was for lunchtime, and it was just a big razzle-dazzle in the afternoon. It drew some criticism for that, but I think when you see the kinescopes, it's a lot of high energy. When kids come home from lunch, they don't want, Ned Locke had a good line about it, they don't want to further their education at lunch. They just want a diversion. So they want a break in their day. And it was loud, it was noisy, and that was part of the charm.
Of course, Bozo was great. We ran home from school at lunchtime, and, you'd have your bologna sandwich and white bread and stuff like that, and you'd watch Bozo, and then you'd time everything. The grand prize game would get done, and then you'd run back to school. Because the grand prize game was huge, and every kid wanted to be on the grand prize game.
There's a 7-year to 8-year wait for tickets. In fact, the Wall Street Journal came to Chicago because they didn't believe there was a local show that there's a 7-year wait for, because the Johnny Carson show and the big shows didn't have a wait that long, and they came and did a big article on the show.
And not only did they entertain children, they entertained the children's parents as well. A lot of stuff. I can remember a bit when Marshall was on the show, and I laugh about this, and I know this is an adult audience watching this, and now I will lick the envelope with my magic tongue. And Bob Bell said, "Oh, Wiz, the mommies like your magic tongue." That would just bust up an adult, the kids, right over their head.
Bob Bell was the master of that. He could look straight at you and say things that you just don't want to answer, you know what I mean? Like one time I says, "I'm going to duty on the rabbit." He says, "Well, if you're going to duty on the rabbit, I'm getting out of here."
A lot of these guys who did kid shows, by the way, didn't go in expecting to do a kid show. Somebody like Bill Jackson and Fraser Thomas, those are the exceptions. They wanted to do the kid shows. Other guys like Bob Bell, Ray Rayner, they thought they'd be newsreaders, broadcasters, or sometimes just entertainers. And here they get told on a Thursday that Monday they're going to be on a kid show, and if they don't like it, there's the door. So as a result, like Bob Bell, he'd read the news in the morning, and he'd fill in on sports and weather whenever they needed him. And then later on, when he got more connected with kid shows, they gave him duties like hosting the Three Stooges show. In fact, after a period, Bob never appeared on camera when he wasn't in makeup.
Bob Bell probably was the greatest Bozo of all time. Bob Bell's a legend, I think. I mean, the guy was a great Bozo. He really was.
My first meeting with Bob Bell was very funny. I was doing the show, and there was this rather dignified man in a gray three-piece suit. And he's smiling at me. And I'm sitting there going, must be some GN executive. I mean, silver hair, three-piece suit, very distinguished. And he goes, "How's it going, Bose?" I said, "Oh, fine, fine. You'll have to excuse me, sir. We're about to do the grand prize game. And that's a game we do with the kids here on the show. Nice talking with you." And as I turned to walk away, I heard him remark to a stagehand, "Well, that silly son of a gun doesn't know who I am." And now I'm going, oh man, did I just offend some Tribune executive? You know, is this that Dowdle guy I'm always hearing so much about? And I said to Roy, who's the geezer in the suit? And Roy goes, that's Bob Bell. And I went, that's Bob Bell.
Ray Rayner, I figured, probably lived at the studio. He was there in the morning doing a morning show, Ray Rayner and Friends. Then he'd take a break. He'd come back for Bozo Circus. And then for so many years, he did the Dick Tracy show at 4 o'clock. And then when that folded, I guess they didn't give him any reprieve. They gave him a show called Rocket to Adventure, which was the same setup. He was, instead of a detective, now he was a spaceman. But it was the same run of cartoons. So
Ray Rayner had been a prisoner of war during the Second World War. That he had a real fear of animals. That was one of the things Frazier told me, was that Frazier had no problems dealing with, you know, Lester Fisher and the zoo animals. Frazier was always very composed with that thing, but it terrified Rayner. He just had a fear of animals in general. And the stagehands knew this, and they would literally torment that poor duck. And when the show started, they would flip the box over in the direction of Ray Rayner, and that annoyed duck would head in Rayner's direction with mayhem on its mind.
Ray Rayner, what a career he had here, going from doing, like, you know, early music shows and things like that. One of the weirdest memories I have, and I don't know if I've ever told you about this, was I must have been 3 years old maybe, and my mom and dad dropped my sister and I off at my great aunt's, who raised my mom, and she has the TV on. It's Ray Rayner's dance party thing, and I'm looking, and my mom and dad are on there dancing. And as a kid, I could not figure this out. It's like, that's my mom and dad. What are they doing on TV? How did they get on TV?
Don Sandberg, again, appeared only briefly. Well, Don Sandberg appeared on camera as Sandy. He likes to call it Sandy the Clown. For some reason, Ned Locke always called it Sandy the Tramp. But Don gets a big credit for actually shaping the Bozo show. People like Al Hall and others will tell you it was Don Sandberg that pretty much came up with the structure. Even though it was a franchised idea, he's the one that put his own individual stamp on the show. He's the one that developed the rhythm, the structure, and in the early days, he wrote most of the material.
Sandberg and I had a lot in common, is that we had that kind of wise guy humor going for us. When Don Sandberg had been the producer on the show, he fired Al Hall. And Al was annoying me one day because he was just yelling at me to keep things moving and stop this. And I finally stopped, and I turned to Sandberg. I said, what are you waiting for? Fire him again.
Don Sandberg is a great talker, a great genius as far as comedy bits. He wrote most of the things that 40 years later they were still doing on the Bozo show. You know, they may have changed a couple of bits here and there, but they were still Don's original skits and ideas. So why he ever left to go to Hollywood, I guess, you know, the Banana Splits was a little more appealing to him at the time than the Bozo show, but I think Don should have stayed in Chicago, and but Don's a good guy.
Ned Locke, by all accounts, now I think he might be an exception in the sense that he was pretty much the same off camera and on. He was the happy-go-lucky, jolly guy. And that's probably why he made the best ringmaster. If you think of Bozo Circus, everything is bounced off him. It's really, Alan Hall, the producer-director, once said that it really should have been called Ned's Circus, because Ned was really the guy that hosted everything. And he's right, he was the one that introduced the games, hosted a lot of them, introduced the clowns, introduced the show.
He was a great ad-libber. There was nothing that couldn't happen when he was on radio or television that he couldn't walk his way through. I remember him telling me about one time when they had a bear act on the Bozo show. And the bear became unruly and was starting to attack the trainer. Well, he went in there with his microphone and used it as a club to beat the bear off of the trainer.
Frazier Thomas, you know, with Frazier, it's interesting because he participated in two different types of shows. His show, which was kind of what I referred to earlier, a quiet, intimate show, one-on-one. And then towards the end of his career, management decided to put him on, combine his show with Bozo Circus. And unfortunately, it didn't work out because Frazier was not the same type of personality as Ned Locke. Frazier essentially took over for Ned Locke. And whereas Ned was just outgoing and boisterous, again, Frasier kind of withdrawn, and he could deal with kids one-on-one very well. But a studio full of 300 screaming kids, not quite so well.
I liked Frasier very much. I thought he was very funny. And I think part of the reason was I didn't take Frasier as seriously as everyone else did. And Frasier never liked people to ad-lib. You just did it the way you rehearsed it.
He was used to going by the script. When you go out there, you go by the script. And I remember the first week he was on, Cookie would say this in rehearsal. He said, "That's not in the script." And Bob Bell would say, "Well, what are you talking about?" You know, and it used to drive him mad because he was so used to going by the script.
We were doing a bit, and right in the middle of a bit, I went, Thomas. Would that be a Welsh name? And he said, "Why, yes. My ancestors came from Wales." And I went, well, I knew they didn't come from people.
Roy Brown, again, is another unsung hero of Chicago children's television. Part of the reason is because he didn't appear in front of the TV screen as himself. Most people remember him as Cookie, but even if they remember him as that, they had, a lot of people don't realize that his career went back to the early 50s. He started out as a puppeteer for Garfield Goose. He did a lot of the artwork when you saw it at the close of like the Ray Rayner show or the set for Family Classics. That was all Roy Brown. Again, the whole idea that a station, they're not going to keep you idle for very long. And people, I think, who remember him as Cookie and have fond memories should realize that, there was much more to the guy than that.
Roy was just a man who loved old-fashioned vaudeville and burlesque comedy, and because I happen to have a pretty good knowledge of that from my years of working at the Variety Arts Center in Los Angeles, that he had somebody to talk to about this stuff. Roy was excited that I knew that I was to be Abbott to his Costello, Hardy to his Laurel.
He could think of what Bob Bell or Joey was going to say before they would say it. And that you can't, I think he could outact, and I know Wally Phillips said this one time, he could outact Jackie Gleason and Art Carney put together. And that's a tall statement to make.
Oh, yeah. Roy Brown is a guy that we knew as kids because we'd see his name at Garfield Goose with the credits. But that's how talented this guy was. It had to be a fun job. Yeah.
Marshall Brodien is a guy that, well, first of all, we all remember him, or at least I do. We all remember from TV Magic Cards. And I think what Marshall brought to these shows was a sense of fun. Remember, he's a magician. So he's all about relating to the audience. And even when he was Wizzo, the clown, it was all about that. It's not surprising to me that he worked out well as a performer, because essentially, as a magician, that's what he was.
A friend of mine had a wrestling bear and a boxing kangaroo, and he went down to see this agent, Howard Schultz, who books a lot of acts. And I walked in the office, and he said to Howard, "This is my friend Marshall Brodien. He's a magician." And Howard Schultz says, "Oh, magicians are a dime a dozen." And I said, "Well, I didn't come here to get a job. I'm always working. I'm appearing at the Cairo Supper Club as a hypnotist. I was a hypnotist for years there. And I work all the time." He says, "Well, I don't know if many magicians are working all the time." I said, "I work all the time." He said, "Wait a minute." He said, "Do you ever hear the Bozo show?" And I said, "No, I never heard of it." And he said, "Why book it?" And he said, "Would you like to appear on it?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to watch it first." So then I went home and I watched the show, and I called him back and said, "I'll appear on there." So what I did when I went on, I worked out tricks that I could work with the clowns, get them involved in it. And when I got through it, they called Howard and said, "Hey, we like this guy. He was real good. We only use an act twice a year, the same act. We'd like him to come back." So I worked it about 14 times as Marshall Brodien. Then I went down to the producer, Don Sandberg, and I said, "I got this costume. It's a wizard's costume. I got an idea for it." So he said, "Let's try it." So I went on there once with a mustache and a beard and black hair, but not a lot of makeup on the eyes, and did a few tricks and looked different. And then I went on again to try it. Then I start rolling my eyes, and they liked that. And Cookie says, "Why don't you blacken your eyes? Make them look weird." And then I started, one time I was doing a trick, and I went doo-dee, accidentally like that, doo-dee, doo-dee, doo, and people laughed. And then I had the stone, I called it the mysterious stone, the magic stone. And one day I did a trick called the stocks of Zanzibar, where I put Cookie in the stocks and I make them disappear. And without thinking, I took the stone and I touched Bozo. "I'm going to touch you with the stone of Zanzibar." And he says, "I remember when you got stoned at the Zanzibar," and start laughing, and it became the stone of Zanzibar. And everything just went together.
I don't think Marshall gets the due that he is deserved. And I mean that sincerely. If you look at a lot of those bits that they performed on the Bozo show, they all revolved around Marshall. And Roy helped Marshall in the beginning years with his character.
They had a small stable, and again, you mentioned Roy Brown and Ned Locke and Bob Bell and Ray Rayner. You had, and Fraser Thomas. You had a core group of very talented people, and they wore many hats, literally and figuratively, and they created a stable of children's icons that no television station in the nation was able to replicate, and no station in America will ever do it again.
No, Bob Bell, he pretty much put his stamp on Bozo. In fact, a lot of people may know that his interpretation of Bozo is the basis for Krusty the Clown on The Simpsons. But I think what some people forget is that Bob Bell was not a children's entertainer. He brought the disc jockey sensibilities. So a lot of times, his Bozo, as funny as he was a little cantankerous. It was more of a Bozo out of burlesque, kind of the con man out of burlesque. What Joey brought, his Bozo was a lot cheerier, a lot more kid-friendly, and Bob, and this is no fault of his, he had some health problems. When Joey came around, he was younger, he was more energetic, and his Bozo, it was like all of a sudden Bozo had a shot of adrenaline. So, and he was a stand-up comic. So he was able to think on his feet a little better than a lot of people. Not that Bob Bell couldn't, and Bob Bell had some classic ad-libs, but I think Joey brought a fresher perspective to Bozo, and I think he deserves a lot more credit than just being the Bob Bell replacement.
Nothing I did ever pleased Al Hall. Al would yell at us all the time. It'd be very funny. I remember one day we were trying to find out a way to make a bit funny, and Marshall and Roy and I are sitting there and we're ad-libbing and we're coming up with gags, and we're just ad-libbing and we're discussing how we can make this bit funny. And we were wasting time as far as Al was concerned. It's like, just shut up and do the bit. And finally he goes, "Will you three idiots stop fooling around and just do the bit?" And Roy stopped and he looked at Al and went, "Al, you realize, of course, you're talking to three men in clown suits." And that made Al laugh, and that was basically how we basically kept from killing each other.
To think how long Bozo's Circus was on the air, and to be the ringmaster and to put on the makeup every single day, or Bob Trendler to come up with the musical, Al Hall, the producer, to come up with the acts, and Wizzo to come up with new tricks every single day, 5 days a week, for an hour. Live. It's an amazing feat, and it's an era that will not come back, but it's also an era that should be remembered and revered for the tremendous talent that was involved, and most importantly, the impact that it had on several generations of boys and girls growing up in Chicago.
Local programming today, even in Chicago, it's just news and sports. The only person who's still doing an unusual character show is Rich Coase.
The way that I got involved with Svengoolie was pretty much as just a fan of, local productions. I really liked what Jerry was doing with Svengoolie, and I sent him jokes and material, and I'd been a fan of his from when he did his radio stuff, and when he was doing the Svengoolie stuff, which at the time was only voiceover. I just want to let him know that I liked what he did, and started sending jokes, and he used them and asked me for more of it, and as that show became a videotape show, he said, could you write a bit about this or whatever? And sure, I was more than happy to, and eventually it worked into my working with him on a full-time basis.
I think the last of the live guys right now is Rich Coase from Svengoolie. And Jerry G. Bishop was the original Svengoolie, but now, Rich Coase, who does great stuff with the Three Stooges, he does a more modern-day Andy Starr, And I think he's talented as Svengoolie also.
Back at 32, I remember when people would come in who were in management, and it was like, well, let's not make this more than it's supposed to be, because to them it was just a guy in a vampire suit who was supposed to come out of the coffin and go, "Who, and now, kids, a frightening movie." And they didn't understand why there was so much production and why there was so much writing and posting and everything. Although we didn't post stuff as much at 32. We pretty much did most of it live to tape when I was doing Son of Svengoolie there.
You know, Svengoolie's appeal is that he is local. He's been around for a long time. It's multi-generational now. There are a lot of people who grew up with that show, fondly remember him on Fox, or I was WFLD before they owned it. And he's been here 10 years already. So, I mean, he's been here a good tenure of the whole Svengoolie thing. And I think people appreciate the fact that we don't try and make that show anything more than it is, which is, you know, cheesy horror movies with a goofy host and a funny little set.
Rich and I are very similar in height and build. And they wanted to do a thing at the Emmys one year with Svengoolie and Bozo. And I said, wouldn't it be funny if we wore each other's costume and makeup? Because we're both about the same height and same build. But you do the Svengoolie voice, and I'll do the Bozo voice in the Svengoolie makeup. And he says, yeah, he says, that'd be the greatest 5 minutes before they fired us.
As a kid, I was afraid of everything. I was so frightened by things. And now, what am I doing? Now I'm just frightened of unemployment.
Sits, Ubu, sits. Good dog. Good night, Mr. Walters.
Tony, can you shut up?
Meow.